Welcome to Kings Mountain, North Carolina. This small southern town is found in the foothills of the Tar Heel State, nestled in between Charlotte, Shelby, and Spartanburg, South Carolina. Despite being right off I-85, the town often goes overlooked by passers-by, but if you take a moment to hop off and talk to a few locals, they'll be sure to tell you about the town's rich history and the values that we hold dear, including faith, family, patriotism, and the honor of sacrifice.
I grew up in Kings Mountain. It's been the home of several major important historical events, including a gold rush in the early 1800s that took place on part of this land I'm standing on now. But the most important historical event that took place here happened just a mile that way.
That historical event, from which the town takes its name, happens just a hop and a skip over the South Carolina border. In its time, Thomas Jefferson called it the turn of the tide of success in the American Revolution. But despite this, almost nobody today knows about this battle. Come join me as we walk the trails of redcoats and patriots, and go explore the forgotten history of the Battle of Kings Mountain.
Prior to the Battle of Kings Mountain, the British actually had a very large string of victories in the South.
The South was a hotbed of Loyalist support during the war. The British successfully landed in Savannah, Georgia, moved up to Charleston, and moved up through South Carolina. In May of 1780, the British met American forces in Waxhaw, South Carolina, where they famously gave no quarter towards American troops who were trying to surrender. Of the 420 Americans, over 100 of them were killed, 50 of them were wounded, and many more captured. The British eventually found their way to upstate South Carolina, where they camped out a few miles in between what is modernly known as Blacksburg, South Carolina, and Kings Mountain, North Carolina. Despite the modern town being in North Carolina, the battle itself actually took place in the southern sister state. The British chose this location because of the fact that the area around it was very thick and wooded, but the top of the hill was flat and plain, and you could see for a very long distance, as you can see in this footage here.
Now, much of the mountain that you see today is pretty wooded, but it's fairly managed by the state government of South Carolina and the federal government. They have split control over the area. Whereas during the battle, it was actually a lot thicker. The woods they weren't managed by anybody, and so it was a lot easier for Patriot forces to be able to sneak around and be able to conceal themselves. This was at their advantage because the top of the mountain, where the British forces were camped out, was completely bare.
The British were led by Major Patrick Ferguson, who interestingly was the only non-colonial American at the battle. Major Ferguson was Scottish. He was deployed to South Carolina in 1780 by British General Cornwallis, and he had had an interaction with these Patriot forces before. Colonel Isaac Shelby, who was one of the Patriot commanders at the battle, had an interaction with Major Ferguson at the Battle of Musgrove's Hill on August 18, 1780. It was actually Major Ferguson's pursuit of Colonel Shelby that led him to Kings Mountain. Ferguson was hoping to scare the Americans into submission.
He warned American forces in the area to desist from attacking the British, or else he would, quote, march over the mountains, hang their leaders, and lay waste to the country with fire and sword. This message had the opposite intended effect. Instead of scaring the Americans, it galvanized them into action.
The American forces were led by many men, including the aforementioned Colonel Isaac Shelby. In total, there were about 910 American militiamen present at the Battle of Kings Mountain. But interestingly, only few of them were actually from South Carolina.
The battle was mainly fought by a group of Americans from across the states called the Over Mountain Men. Groups from Virginia, Tennessee, and parts of North Carolina came to fight in this thick overgrowth. They weren't part of the Continental Army. They were just regular militiamen that were fighting against the British that were wreaking havoc in their territory.
The British eventually set up shop on top of Kings Mountain at the highest point, which was called King's Pinnacle. The Patriot forces, which had been running all across the South Carolina upstate, eventually found themselves to be near the site of the future Battle of Cowpens. Through scouting reports, they found out the location of the British and moved over 2 days and 2 nights. By sunrise of October 7th, the day of the battle, they had forged the Broad River, which was 15 miles from Kings Mountain. By early afternoon, they arrived and immediately surrounded the ridge and began their assault.
The morning of the battle had been raining, but luckily, as any good hunter knows, wet leaves and wet ground help soak up sound, which helped the American forces sneak up this mountain without alerting the British. The Americans only had one command from their superiors: "Don't wait on us. Let every man be his own officer." That morning, 910 men split into 4 groups began scaling the mountain right before the battle began at 3 p.m.
The battle commenced once Loyalist scouts had detected and opened fire upon the Patriot militia moving up the mountain. The Patriots were able to cut off any escape routes and surround the Tory forces. Several attempts were made at trying to repel the Patriots, including numerous bayonet charges, some of which resulted in hand-to-hand combat among the opposing forces. These attempts did little to quell the Patriots, and they pressed further into enemy lines. Being totally pushed back, Ferguson attempted to clear a path for escape, but was riddled with bullets and dragged away by his own horse. Ferguson's second-in-command then raised a white flag, but they were not met with ceasefire. Rather, cries of "Remember Waxhaws" and "Buford's Quarter" filled the lungs of the Americans as they confronted the assaulting Loyalists. American commanders were able to soon regain control over their men, and after 65 long minutes, the fighting was over. Loyalist Captain Alexander Chesney recalled immediately after the battle in his diary, "We passed the night, where we surrendered amidst the dead and groans of the dying. Those who had not surgical aid or water to quench their thirst. Early the next morning, we marched at rapid pace toward Gilberttown between double lines of Americans, the officers in the rear and obligated to carry 2 rifles each, which was my fate, although wounded and stripped of my shoes and buckles in the inclement weather, without cover or provision until Monday night, when each was served with an ear of corn. At Gilberttown, a mock trial was held, and 24 sentenced to death, 10 of whom suffered before the approach of Tarleton's force obliged them to move towards the Yadkin, cutting and striking us by the road in a savage manner. The final casualty tally was overwhelmingly stacked by Loyalists." At the conclusion of the battle, Americans suffered very low casualties. Only 28 killed and 62 wounded. Only 90 men, a tenth of their force. The British, on the other hand, suffered much higher casualties. Of the British forces here, 290 were killed, 163 were wounded, and 668 were declared missing or captured by the American forces. Over 1,100 men of the 2,000 men that were here. Colonel Ferguson was only 36 years old when he was killed here at the Battle of Kings Mountain. After the battle, American forces drug his body down the mountain, urinated on it, and desecrated it before wrapping it in oxhide and burying it here. The rest of the British forces that were left here were just scattered about, left to wolves and vultures to feed on over the following days. In 1930, the American government erected this monument
as a symbol of friendship and unity between the British and the Americans after decades of peace between the two countries following the War of 1812.
The battle had a significant impact in driving Cornwallis' forces first to their next defeat at Cowpens, and then later toward their ultimate defeat at the Battle of Yorktown. Despite its importance at the time, and despite Thomas Jefferson calling it the turn of the tide of success of the Revolution, the battle site remained mainly forgotten for many decades. It was placed into the care of the Daughters of the American Revolution at some point, and they lobbied unsuccessfully several times for Congress to make the area a national park. Eventually, they would get some help from a pretty powerful source. On October 7th, 1930, President Herbert Hoover gave an address at the site for the 150th anniversary of the Battle of Kings Mountain. It's estimated that over 75,000 people were present for the speech, and thousands more heard it on the radio up and down the East Coast. The next year, Congress voted to make the site of the Battle of Kings Mountain a national park, honoring the memory and sacrifice of the men who fought and died for the cause of independence at this battle. Hoover's speech serves not only as a reminder of the grave importance of the battle and its victory, it serves not only as a reminder of the dedication of those who sacrificed their lives for freedom and for America, but it also serves as an encouragement for us to continue to sacrifice each and every day and to never let go of the precious freedom that we have here in the United States of America. My fellow countrymen, this is a place of inspiring memories. Here less than 1,000 men, inspired by the urge of freedom, defeated a superior force entrenched in this strategic position. This small band of patriots turned back the dangerous invasion, well designed to separate and dismember the United Colonies. The Battle of Kings Mountain stands out in our national memory, not only because of the valor of the men of the Carolinas, Georgia, Tennessee, Kentucky, and Virginia, who trode here 150 years ago, but also because of the devotion of those men revived the courage of the despondent colonies and set a nation upon the road of final triumph in American independence. The great intangibles of the spirit of a people are immeasurable. Our sense of freedom, of liberty, of security, our confidence of future progress, our traditions of past glory and sacrifice, the example of our heroes, the spiritual enrichment of our people, these are the true glories of America. The world about us is tormented with the spiritual and economic struggles that attend changing ideals and systems. Old faiths are being shaken, but we must follow our own destiny. Our institutions are a growth. They come out of our history as a people. Our ideals are a binding spiritual heritage. We cannot abandon them without chaos. We can follow them with confidence. Our problems are the problems of growth. They are not the problems of decay. They are less difficult than those which confronted generations before us. The forces of righteousness and wisdom work as powerfully in our generation as in theirs. The flame of freedom burns as brightly in every American heart. There need be no fear for the future of a republic that seeks inspiration from the spirit of the men who fought at the Battle of Kings Mountain.